Tonight, I have something gentle to share with you. A story not of kings or battles, but of cold, of long winters, and the quiet strength it took to outlast them. So if your day has been long, if your mind is carrying too much, this is the moment to let it all soften. Dim the lights, sink deeper into your blankets, and let the weight of the world fall away. We're travelling far back tonight, not to a palace or a castle, but to a peasant's cottage at the edge of a forest. It is the year 1327. Instant snow is falling outside, slow and silent. And inside the cottage, the air hangs still. No fireplace, no hearth, just breath, just bodies, just hope. Most people, when they think of the medieval world, imagine crackling fires in great halls, meat roasting, torches flickering against stone. But that was not the world most people lived in. For countless peasants, the ones who made the bread, spun the wool, tilled the frozen earth, winter meant surviving without heat, without meat, without rest. And yet they endured, with straw, with stones, with shared warmth, and quiet rituals, with whispered prayers and windows stuffed with cloth, with dreams, with silence. Tonight we will step into that world, slowly, gently, and trace how the poorest people of the Middle Ages made it through the coldest nights, not with roaring fires, but with resilience carved into their bones. What did they eat when nothing grew? Where did they sleep when frost crept indoors? And what did they believe might protect them when blankets, roofs, and time itself seemed to fail? Place of you boring past for sleep, where the quiet stories live. So close your eyes if you'd like. Let your breathing slow. And together, let's slip into a winter that was darker, quieter, and far colder than we ever imagined. The first thing to understand is that winter didn't arrive with a roar. It came in softly, like a breath held in the hedgerows, a silence that thickened as October faded, as fields turned brittle, and smoke thinned into the wind. There were no weather forecasts, no management, only the feel of the soil stiffening beneath your boots, the birds quieting, the days shrinking so fast you might miss them if you blinked. In a small thatched cottage timbered low with one room for all, the cold came first as a suggestion, a draught under the door, a tremble in your toes as you woke before dawn. The animals were restless. Even the dog curled tighter than usual. There were no grand hearths here, no carved mantles or blazing logs. Most peasants in early medieval Europe, say in the 13th or 14th century, did not have fireplaces at all, not the kind we picture. At most, there might be a simple fire pit dug into the centre of the room, with a hole in the thatched roof to let the smoke curl out. But many had nothing at all, because firewood was precious, and the rules about gathering it were stricter than you'd expect. The forest, you see, did not belong to them, even if it grew behind their cottage, even if it had stood there since their great-grandmother's day. The trees were often the property of the lord, the manor, the church, or the crown. To take a fallen branch was a gamble. A fellow tree, even a sickly one, might earn you a fine. Oh, worse! And so many families began the winter not with piles of firewood, but with small bundles of twigs, dried dung bricks, straw, or if they were lucky, peat cut from a bog and stacked to dry months before. The rims were cold, not a little cold, but the kind of cold that sinks into stone, that lives in the floor, that wakes you at night with its fingers on your spine. The walls were made from wattle and daub, woven sticks coated in a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. They could keep out the wind, mostly, but not the damp. The roof thatch would drip in a heavy storm. The windows, if there were any at all, were holes covered by cloth or oiled parchment. Glass was for the church. not for the people. So the cold seeped in. It came through the cracks. It curled along the beams. It settled over the sleeping children and creaked the joints of the elderly. In these homes, light was fleeting. The sun, when it came, barely pierced the haze. And when night fell, which it did early and often, the room dimmed into shadows. A rushlight might flicker in the corner. A thin strip of reed or cloth dipped in animal fat. It sputtered and smelt slightly sour, and when it went out, darkness pressed in like a tide. But the cold did not come all at once. It deepened over weeks. First, you wore more layers to bed. Then you brought the animals indoors, the pig, the hens, perhaps even the goat. Their breath warmed the air just slightly. Their shuffles a kind of comfort. Eventually, the straw on the floor grew thick, replaced not because it was fresh, but because there was nothing else to do with the ore. It became a kind of insulation, crunchy, musty, full of smells, but warmer than bare earth. The family, mother, father, children, shared one bed, a rough frame if there was one. More often, a mattress of rushes on the ground. If they had a blanket, it was wool, heavy, damp to the touch. Bodies pressed together, not just for comfort, but because it was the only source of heat they could count on. To be cold in those days was not just unpleasant. It was dangerous. Children could lose fingers to frostbite. The elderly could go to sleep and never wake again. Coughs turned to fevers, and even a mild illness could become fatal when your body couldn't stay warm enough to fight. Yet, through it all, there was no outcry, no complaints shouted into the night, only quiet endurance. Soft songs sung under breath, hands warmed under arms, and the patient practiced art of waiting. Waiting for dawn, waiting for the next delivery of peat from a neighbor, waiting for the sun to climb just a little higher in the sky. They marked time not with calendars, but with the way the frost moved up the walls, with the silence of birds, with how quickly the butter hardened in the pantry. They waited, and in waiting they survived. Sometimes in the very worst winters, like the deep freezes of the 14th century, families would sleep through whole days, conserving energy like hibernating animals. The room would be still. No fire, no sound but breathing and the occasional groan of the wind against the eaves. Even the bread was cold, hard as wood, soaked in broth if there was any to make it edible. In those moments it was not just about endurance. It was about simplicity, about making peace with less, with a slower rhythm, with the knowledge that hardship was not a disruption, but the very shape of life. You didn't try to escape the cold. You let it in, and you learned to live beside it. A candle could not warm the house, but it could warm your hands just for a moment. A bowl of pottage could not last the week, but it could quiet the growl in your belly tonight. Lullaby, hummed in the dark, could not chase away the frost, but it might help a child fall asleep. The people who lived like this were not foolish. They were not numb. They were practical, resilient, and quietly wise. They taught their children to notice the sky, to touch the stone of the wall and know what kind of night it would be. They knew that the cold would come, that it would settle in their bones, and that when it did, they would meet it with stillness, not with defiance, but with ritual, layering cloth, pulling clothes, sleeping when there was nothing else to do. And somehow spring always came, though it seemed impossibly far away, though the days grew darker before they grew light again. It always came. But before it did, before the lambs returned to the fields, and the snow melted into streams, there was this time, this quiet, hard, beautiful time, where people lived without fire, without comfort, but never without each other. There was no central heating, no roaring hearth to gather round, no chimney to send smoke trailing into the sky. So, instead, warmth came from what you wore. Not in the way we think of fashion now, with choices made in comfort and convenience, but as a survival ritual enacted each morning with quiet deliberation. A peasant's winter wardrobe was not vast. It was humble, practical, layered with memory and use. The base layer, often the only layer for warmer months, was the linen shift, coarse, off-white, homespun. It scratched slightly against the skin, but it was dependable. Linen kept you dry, and that meant it helped keep you warm. Over this came wool, sometimes thick and heavy, sometimes thinner, depending on what the family could spin or barter for. Wool was the guardian against the cold. It trapped heat close to the body, even when the air in the cottage dropped low enough to frost the water buckets. Cloaks, tunics, hoods and caps, all fashioned from wool, dyed in muted browns, greys and greens, formed a soft armour against the season's long sea, and each item told a story. A patch on a tunic shoulder might come from a grandmother's cloak. A hood, once made for a grown son, might be tied, smaller for a daughter. Clothes were mended, turned, restitched, until their threads barely held together. Scarves were not just wrapped around the neck, but tied around feet at night, or used to plug up a gap under the door when wind hissed through. And the feet, the feet, always cold, always the last to warm. Shoes, when worn, were simple leather turn shoes, soft-soled and thin, not suited for snow. So inside the home, most went barefoot or wrapped their feet in cloth, stuffing them into layers of straw when walking about. At night, socks might be wool, but more often they were simply lengths of cloth wrapped around the legs and feet, tied with string or tucked beneath layers of blanket. Mittens, too, were precious. Some were made with fingers fused together, like a baby's swaddling, better to share heat. And for those without mittens, sleeves were pulled long, stretched over hands, made into makeshift pockets of warmth. Children were bundled in anything that fit, often multiple layers too large or too small, garments passed down from sibling to sibling until the original shape was forgotten. There was a kind of intimacy to it all, to the weight of clothing, to the way it slowed you down. You did not rush through the day bundled in so many layers. You moved steadily, quietly, your body swaddled like the earth in snow. Dressing was a task that took time. In the dim light of morning, before chores began, each item was lifted, shaken, smoothed with chilled fingers, and placed on the body like a second skin. Even sleepwear was layered. You slept in your day clothes or added garments over them, one upon another. There were no closets, no separate nightgowns with lace or comfort, just the same woolen garments, softened by sleep, shaped by breath, warmed slowly through the hours of the night, and beneath all of it, the body learned how to retain its own warmth. Movements became economical. Hands were kept close to the chest, shoulders hunched slightly to preserve heat, voices lowered to conserve breath. The world outside might howl with wind, but inside the heavy fabric and faint candlelight there was a softness. Not comfort perhaps, but familiarity. On especially bitter nights, families would sleep fully dressed. Not a shoe was removed, not a hood taken down. The cold had a way of slipping into your bones while you slept. So, better to be ready, better to be wrapped tightly, arms around bellies, backs to walls, children tucked between adults, layers of clothing still on, like armor against the dark. The smell of the wool was always close, earthy, smoky, sometimes tinged with the scent of damp or sweat. It clung to the fabric, to your skin, to the straw beneath you. But it was not unpleasant. It smelled like home, like winter, like survival. Washing was rare. Water was too cold, too far, too precious. Clothes were aired out when the sun allowed, brushed, beaten, but seldom soaked. The garments absorbed the season. They bore the marks of frost, of ash, of salt, from tears and laughter alike. And when something finally tore beyond mending, it was not thrown away. It was stripped into rags, woven into padding, stuffed into cracks in the wall. Nothing was wasted. Every thread was memory, every hole a mark of having endured. In this way, clothing was more than fabric. It was a shelter, a companion. A quiet, rustling warmth wrapped close to the skin when the world outside refused to offer its own. When snow pressed against the walls and wind crept down the chimneyless roofline, it was not the fire that kept you safe. It was the cloak passed down 3 generations. The shift mended so often the thread had become a patchwork of years. The cap pulled low over your ears, lined with the softness of an old lamb's wool rag. You knew these things. You trusted them. They held you. Through the long night, through the long winter, they held you. The cottage stood quiet in the snow, its roof low and heavy with frost, its door crooked and sealed tight with bundled straw. From the outside, it looked as though it might crumble at the slightest wind, but within there was life. Stillness, yes, but life all the same. The walls, made of stone or wattle and daub, were thick but draughty. Cracks were patched with mud and moss, the work of many hands over many years. Inside, light was rare. A single window, if there was one, was small and shuttered. In some homes there were no windows at all, just narrow slits that let in more cold than sun. The air was close, not unpleasant, but lived in. A mingling of wool and smoke, of dried herbs and cold breath. It was the scent of patience. Of long days passed slowly. There was no fireplace, no grand hearth where flames licked upward in welcome. In many peasant homes, fire was not central. It was a luxury, a danger, a thing to be used sparingly and watched closely. Instead, warmth came from the very way the house was built, and how the people lived within it. The floor was earth, packed hard and swept, often. In some homes, a thin layer of straw was spread to soften the step, to catch moisture and sand. This straw was turned regularly, and in the corners it was stacked deeper, layered like quiet little nests, where animals or children might curl during the day. Roofs were thatched thick, sloped to shed the snow, but beneath that dry crown the ceiling dipped low. It held heat in the same way a cupped hand holds breath. In winter, the family lived smaller. They drew in. Rooms that might have been used for work or storage in warmer months were abandoned. Everyone slept closer, sometimes in one room, sometimes in one bed. They made walls out of bodies, boundaries out of blankets. If there was a fire at all, it might be a small pit sunk into the floor, or a stone bowl on which peat or dung or sparse wood smouldered slowly. The smoke curled upward and out through a hole in the roof, or drifted loosely inside, painting the beams with soot. It was not warmth in the way we think of it now. It did not fill the house, but it made a small circle of comfort, and everyone stayed near it. At night, they lowered themselves to sleep in places that held warmth from the day, against walls that had faced the sun, on straw that remembered body heat. The bedding was not elaborate. It might be a sack of chaff, a mat of reeds, or a mattress made from dried heather or hay. Over this went whatever they had: old cloaks, tattered linens, woolen rugs, even burlap sacks. Layers were everything, not just on the body, but beneath and above it. Some beds were simple platforms of wood, lifted just off the ground to avoid the cold that seeped up from the earth. Others were nothing more than straw laid in a hollow near the wall. If you pressed your ear to the ground, you could hear the faint groan of frost outside, but inside, bundled and still, there was a hush, a kind of peace. In some homes, the animals slept inside, chickens in baskets, a goat tied near the door, a pig curled near the wall. Their breath, their warmth, their gentle sounds, all of it became part of the house. There was no true separation between man and beast. All lived together, sharing what little heat could be kept. The walls themselves became tools of survival. Herbs were hung from rafters, not just for medicine or cooking, but because they gave off faint scents that warmed the imagination. Thyme, rosemary, lavender. In the absence of warmth, scent became comfort. So too did texture. A wall might be lined with rough cloth, or branches woven and packed with straw to keep the wind out. A curtain, even made from sackcloth, made a difference. It slowed the cold, it quieted the room, and in the stillness every sound mattered. The creak of the roof beams as they settled under snow, the whisper of straw as someone shifted beneath it, the slow drip of thawing ice from the eaves. These were the sounds of winter survival, of time passing gently. On the coldest nights, the breath of the sleepers rose in mist. It hung in the air above them, fading slowly like smoke from an unseen fire. And in that soft mist, in that breath made visible, was a kind of resilience, an understanding, passed down and practiced, that life could continue, not in comfort perhaps, but in presence, in persistence. Children were told to sleep close, not to wander from their nests in the dark. Their dreams, shaped by cold and closeness, drifted through rooms like quiet stories. No one slept alone. Even when illness struck and someone was separated from the others, a hand would reach out, a voice would murmur, a body would lean near. No one was left to the cold entirely, and the home itself, this small quiet shell, became a kind of cradle, a place not to escape winter, but to outlast it. Each stone, each bundle of straw, each shared breath was a thread in the fabric that kept them alive. When morning came, it came gently, not with sun always, but with sound, the rustle of cloth, the soft stirring of animals, the hush of voices greeting another day. Another night survived, and so the house remained, still, humble, enduring, a body of its own, breathing slowly with those inside it. Not grand, not warm, but enough. Evening descended slowly in the medieval countryside, and as the pale light slipped from the doorways and windows, so too did the chill. It arrived not with drama, but with certainty, the kind of cold that did not bite all at once, but instead crept in, touching fingertips, creeping under hems, whispering through wool. And so, as dusk fell, the day's labourers turned to the quiet ritual of preparing for the long night ahead. There was no such thing as changing into pyjamas, no flannel prints or silken robes. Bedclothes, like everything else, were dictated by necessity. Warmth was not an option, it was a strategy. And so, the garments worn to sleep were rarely different from those worn during the day, simply layered with greater care, with more intention. It was less about undressing and more about shifting, about preparing the body not for rest, but for stillness. They wrapped themselves in wool, coarse, hand-woven, heavy with wear. It was scratchy to the touch, but comforting in its weight. A tunic might remain on the body overnight, perhaps loosened at the neck, with another layer drawn over it. A cloak, often patched and dark, might be spread across the shoulders, its folds tucked in close like a second skin. Women often wore long chemises of linen, pale and plain, smelling faintly of lye soap and smoke. Over this they might add a kirtle or a second shift. The fabric, worn thin over time, was soft from countless washes, and, though never truly clean by modern standards, it carried a warmth earned through wear. These were not clothes of vanity, they were clothes of memory, of repetition, of survival. Children, smaller and more vulnerable to the chill, were wrapped tighter. Mothers pulled sleeves over tiny hands and tied woolen bands around ankles. In poorer homes, rags were used, strips of cloth wrapped like soft bindings around limbs to trap the body's warmth. It was a method known not by books but by generations. They learned it from those who had come before and taught it without words. Socks, for those lucky enough to own them, were knitted or stitched from leftover yarn. But more often, feet were wrapped in cloth or tucked beneath another's legs in bed, the shared heat doing the work of wool. Hats were sometimes worn to bed, simple caps or coifs tied under the chin. The ears, so easily numbed, needed shielding, and the head, after all, lost much of the body's warmth. There were no thermostats, no glowing fireplaces in every home. Warmth came not from the house, but from the body, and so people dressed for bed with the knowledge that stillness could be dangerous if the cold was too deep, too sudden. Their layers were not stylish, but they were deliberate. Each fold and knot, each piece of cloth was a decision made against the night. And it wasn't just fabric. They used everything they had, straw mats laid beneath to keep the cold of the earth away. Sometimes dried rushes or heather were added for extra insulation. Furs, when available, were treasured. Not the fine pelts of nobility, but rough sheepskins or goat hides, cured with smoke and stitched at the seams. They were heavy, stiff, and smelt faintly of the animals they once were, but they held heat like few things could. In some households, old sacks were repurposed as sleeping wraps. Grain bags made of thick weave became bedding for the elderly, or children, or those recovering from illness. Quilts, in the way we know them today, were rare among peasants. Instead, there were layers of anything they could stitch together. Remnants of clothing, fragments of curtains, worn scraps from market purchases. Before sleep there were routines, not always spoken, but deeply familiar. A pot of warm ale or diluted wine passed around, more for comfort than for celebration. A final trip outside to empty water or hush the animals. Then a return to the dim room, where the coals in the brazier had burned low, or the candle had already been snuffed. And in that quiet, as families settled in, wrapping scarves tighter, drawing sleeves over knuckles, there was an unspoken trust in the layers they had chosen. The outermost cloak would often be pulled over several people at once, children sandwiched between older siblings. Grandparents placed close to the center, where the heat collected. A dog at the feet, a cat beneath the covers. Even the air between layers mattered. The stillness trapped between one cloth and another created an invisible barrier. Thin as it was, it made all the difference. The secret was not in the thickness of a single layer, but in the arrangement of many. Loose over tight, wool over linen, hide over cloth. They adjusted their clothing, not with mirrors, but with instinct. A chill across the collarbone, pull the shift tighter. Toes aching with cold, press them against a sibling's legs, and if the night was especially cruel, if frost crept into the very breath they exhaled, they did not complain. They drew deeper into themselves, into their coverings, and waited. Sometimes they murmured before sleep, not prayers always, but stories, whispers of a warmer time, tales of saints or folk creatures, of summer feasts and harvest dances. These stories were not just for comfort. They were a distraction from the long cold silence that followed. Children, eyes already closing, would listen to these voices with soft attention, the words mingling with the scratch of wool and the creak of rafters, and then dreams would come, sometimes strange, sometimes kind. In those dreams, warmth was not so rare. Fires blazed and fields stretched green beneath bright skies. Dreams became a second shelter, softer than the first, and when they awoke, if they had slept at all, their layers were stiff with frost, their breath rose in clouds, but they were there. Another night behind them, another small victory won, with nothing but cloth and closeness. This was how they survived, not by resisting the cold, but by preparing for it, by wrapping themselves in memory, in wool, in patience. The layering of garments was a language of endurance, of love passed hand to hand in the folding of cloth, and in that language, spoken quietly through the long medieval night, they found the warmth they needed. The wind outside had settled to a long, low hum, brushing against the thatched eaves like a hand on an old harp string. Within the dark wooden walls of a peasant's home, the stillness was not silent. It pulsed, softly with the sounds of life settling into rest, fabric shifting, the creak of boards under weight, the occasional snuffle of breath shared in close quarters. Here, in this small room where the air barely stirred, warmth was not a luxury. It was a collective act. To sleep alone was a rarity, not only impractical, but almost unthinkable. The night was too long, the cold too certain. Solitude, for most peasants, was a thing of daylight, of wandering in fields, of tending sheep or pulling weeds in silence. But night pulled people together in the most literal sense. Bodies gathered in corners, pressed shoulder to shoulder, back to back. Sleep was not private, it was shared. Husband and wife, of course, slept side by side, but they were rarely alone in their bed. Children were nestled close, sometimes tucked between their parents, sometimes wrapped beside them like roots around a common stem. If grandparents lived in the household, and many did, they too were drawn into this living arrangement, placed carefully near the centre, where warmth pooled and breath mixed. Beds, if there were any, were wide and low, made more for quantity than comfort. The mattress, little more than a sack filled with straw, would be shared by many, its lumpy surface shaped by nights of collective rest. Those without such beds slept on pallets, bundles of cloth and reeds laid directly on the floor, or atop a wooden bench pulled close to the fire if one was present. Blankets were limited, but bodies were many. This arrangement was not shameful, it was survival. There was no modesty in the face of winter's chill. The boundaries between self and family blurred in the dark. The warmth of another's skin was as essential as food, as fire. Even the smallest child, barely old enough to speak, became part of the fabric of warmth. A knee tucked under a thigh, an arm slung across a chest. These gestures were not deliberate, they were instinct. In the soft dark, they shifted through the night like the slow drift of leaves on a pond. No one slept soundly. A cough would ripple through the group, a dream would stir a child to whisper. Sometimes someone would wake and pull a cover higher, adjust a sleeping sibling's cap, or place a cold foot beneath another's knee. And then the room would settle again, breath sinking in a rhythm older than speech. There were rules, unwritten but known. The youngest were placed toward the center, safest from the chill. The elderly, often frail and thin-skinned, were given the driest spot. The strongest or most robust were stationed near the edges, shielding the rest from drafts that slipped through the doorframe or the ill-fitted planks. These decisions weren't discussed. They were known by custom, absorbed like the rhythm of planting and reaping, and beyond the immediate family. Sometimes others shared the space, a visiting cousin, a widow from down the road, or a farmhand with nowhere else to sleep. Hospitality was measured not in what one offered by day, but what space could be made at night. A blanket divided, a spot cleared on the straw. The bed was not an island, it was a field, open to those who needed shelter. In some homes, livestock were brought indoors for the night. Chickens roosted in baskets, and goats lay in corners, their breath warm against the stone. A cow in the byre shared a wall with a sleeping family, her body radiating heat like a quiet stove. The animal's breath rose and fell in time with the humans, and in the heart of winter, this shared life kept the frost at bay. Children knew no other way. They grew up with the scent of their siblings' hair, the feel of their mother's arm draped over them, the soft snores of their father rumbling through the straw. Dreams came with the warmth of others' skin, and the chorus of breaths like waves in a quiet sea. They learned to fall asleep with someone's foot pressed into their back, and to wake with tangled limbs that belonged to more than one body. Even disputes melted in the darkness. A sibling quarrel over a crust of bread faded when warmth was required. The need to be close overcame the urge to pull away. Forgiveness was silent, unspoken, but understood in the willingness to lie beside one another, to share heat without hesitation. Privacy in the way we know it now did not exist. The darkness did not demand it, and the cold would not permit it. Love, comfort, even grief were public. A mother weeping for a sick child did so within arm's reach of her others. A father grieving a failed harvest lay down in silence among his family, his sorrow shared not in words, but in the stillness of his frame. Sometimes, through the night, stories would be whispered, not loud, not lively, but low and rhythmic, like breath itself. Folk tales, told in darkness, had a different shape. Their edges were softer, their characters kinder, and in these tales, warmth was always found in togetherness. A lost child was rescued not by magic, but by a family's persistence. A home was protected not by stone walls, but by the closeness of those who lived within them. The children would listen, eyes heavy, the sound of their mother's voice laced with sleep. They did not always understand the stories, but they understood the sound, the tone, the gentle rise and fall of familiar words. And they knew deep in their chests that as long as those voices murmured, the cold could not reach them. Even illness, when it came, was met with proximity. A fevered child was not isolated, but held, warmed by bodies, cooled with damp cloths, soothed by the breath of a sibling sharing a pillow. There was danger, of course. Illness spread easily in these close quarters, but fear did not eclipse love. The choice to remain near, even in sickness, was an act of fierce, ordinary devotion, and when loss came, as it sometimes did in winter, it was not met alone. Mourning, like sleep, was shared. A quiet weeping in the night was not ignored. A hand reached out, a cheek pressed against another. These gestures had no ceremony, but they were rituals all the same, a communal way of saying, "We are still here, together." Night after night, this intimacy was repeated. Not always comfortable, not always easy, but always necessary. In the darkness, the body became not just an individual vessel, but a thread in a woven whole. Each person, a strand of warmth twisted around another, holding heat against the press of cold. It was not romantic, not idyllic. It was scratchy and loud, and sometimes someone snored, and sometimes someone kicked. But it was real, it was life. And it worked. This was how peasants faced the long nights of winter, not with roaring hearths or piles of blankets, but with each other, with arms and breath and shared silence, with the warmth of proximity. And in the morning, when the light returned pale and thin through the frost-rimmed window, they would rise slowly, stretching limbs that had stiffened in the cold, laughing at the elbow in the ribs, the toe that had poked through the blanket. They would look at one another, tired but present. And they would know once again they had made it through the night, together. The fire, if there was one, had long since gone cold. A few embers might glow faintly beneath the ash, but by the middle of the night the warmth it once offered had faded to memory. Outside, the wind traced slow, unhurried fingers along the thatch and timber, and the frost settled thick on the glassless window's ledge. Inside, warmth was no longer something one found in the air, but in what clung closest to the skin. Clothing, in the peasant household, was not folded neatly away or placed on shelves at the end of the day. It was kept on the body, layered and heavy, worn to sleep as much as to work. There were no separate wardrobes for night and day. Sleep came wrapped in the same cloth that carried people through the fields and barns. The first layer was linen, often coarse, homespun, but softened by years of use and washings in cold, lye-rich water. It clung close, almost like a second skin, absorbing sweat, protecting from chill, and acting as a barrier against the rougher wool that came next. Over this came tunics or dresses, thickly woven, sometimes patched with care, sometimes threadbare with time. Wool was the fabric of survival. Not soft, not smooth, but warm, stubbornly so. It held heat close, even when the damp crept in. A tunic of wool, cinched with a rope or leather belt, could hold in the body's precious warmth. For children, smaller versions were handed down, sleeves roughly hemmed again and again as they grew. At night, nothing was removed. Instead, more was added. Shawls, cloaks, caps. Anything that could be found was wrapped around the limbs, shoulders and heads of the sleepers. Caps were essential, for heat fled quickly from the scalp, and cold air bit hardest there. A sleeping peasant might look to modern eyes as if prepared for travel, not slumber. But this was the necessity of the season. Even feet were rarely bare. Rough-spun socks or wrapped rags were tied around ankles, and old shoes were sometimes worn right into sleep. Not for comfort, but for the simple fact that bare feet on frozen floors could mean days of pain to follow. Children were bundled tightly, sometimes into layers so thick their arms could hardly bend, their legs tucked beneath them like birds nesting for the night. The ritual of dressing for sleep began before the sun had fully disappeared. As the last light seeped from the sky, garments were shaken out, mended if necessary, draped over shoulders again. Layers were examined not for fashion, but for function. Was this tunic still dry? Did that cloak still smell of the last rain? Clothing was chosen not for appearance, but for its memory of warmth. Sometimes old sheepskins were laid over laps or worn like cloaks. The wool turned inward, against the skin. These were precious things, passed down through families, stitched over with coarse thread where holes had formed. They smelled of lanolin and hay, and of the fields where the sheep had once grazed. In the absence of fire, in homes where the hearth held only a few fading coals, bodies became their own heat source, and clothing their own portable shelter. Each fold, each stitch, each button carved from bone or antler was a defense against the night. There was no shame in sleeping fully clothed. In fact, the idea of removing garments before sleep would have seemed strange, even dangerous. Cold air could slip through the smallest crack, and a single draught might undo the body's fragile hold on warmth. Instead, sleep was a continuation of the day's layering, a descent deeper into the fabric that shielded them from the winter world. Garments were not always clean. Laundry was a laborious task, save for when rivers weren't frozen and soap was available, but cleanliness was a secondary concern. Warmth came first. A tunic worn for days, even weeks, retained the shape and scent of the body. It felt familiar, safe, like a blanket made of memory. In many homes, there was no privacy in dressing or undressing. For all of them, it was always something good to eat. There was unowned and uncovered. The family saw one another in all states of daily life, but even so there was care in the way a mother might help a child pull a cloak tighter, or how a father might shake out a sibling's second tunic and hand it over without a word. These small rituals of preparation were acts of love, quiet and routine. Sometimes, before bed, older women would heat stones near the fire's last breath, wrapping them in cloth and placing them under the bedding, or at the feet of children. The stones gave off a fading warmth, brief but precious. In the absence of such comfort, body heat and clothing had to suffice. Wool cloaks doubled as blankets, leather jerkins were worn to sleep, their stiffness a small price for their ability to block out the wind. Mittens, when available, were worn with the thumbs tucked in or not at all, with hands pulled into sleeves and pressed between thighs or against another body's warmth. In sickness, more layers were added still. A feverish child might be wrapped in every piece of cloth the family owned. If nothing else, old sacks or grain bags were repurposed, cut open, draped over, tied gently but firmly. The layering was both practical and symbolic. It was an attempt to protect what was most vulnerable, to keep in what little warmth illness left behind. Even dreams were shaped by this bundling. In the stillness of sleep, layers became part of the dreamscape, weighty, comforting, enclosing. A child might dream of burrowing into wool-lined caves, or sailing in a boat made of cloaks and shawls, each stitch a star above. And yet, despite the heaviness, sleep came gently. The body, weary from labour, accepted its cocoon of cloth. The breath slowed, the arms relaxed. Beneath the layers, warmth built slowly, simmering in pockets, in elbows curled against ribs, in necks tucked beneath linen folds. The fabric dulled the sounds of the room too. It muffled the coughs, the creaks, the distant bark of a dog outside. The world beyond the cloth became a shadow, soft-edged and far away. Within the folds, there was peace, or something like it. Clothing for peasants was more than attire. It was architecture. It created walls where none stood. It turned the open air of a one-room home into a nest, a womb, a place where breath could be hidden and preserved. Each layer told a story, not of wealth, but of endurance, not of elegance, but of effort. In the morning the sun rose slowly, reluctant and pale. Its warmth was faint, barely enough to stir the frost from the windowsill. But beneath the layers the sleepers stirred, not with surprise, but with familiarity. The clothing clung to them still, marked with the imprint of dreams and the warmth they had made for themselves. They would rise, one by one, stretching arms that had grown stiff, shaking out hems, refastening belts. The layers, now warmed, became armour again, ready for the chores, the cold, the long day ahead. And when night returned, as it always did, the ritual would begin again. Layers, not luxury, but life, not just garments, but guardians, and in each thread, in every faded seam, a quiet testament to what it meant to endure, even with every precaution taken. Layers of wool and linen, cloaks tucked tight around the neck, shared warmth under quilts and sheepskins. There were nights when winter slipped through. It didn't need much room. A crack in the shutter, a gap beneath the door, a breath of frost on the air, and suddenly warmth became something more fragile than before. Inside the peasant's home, light came only from a stub of tallow candle or the final flicker of oil in a clay lamp. The silence was not a peaceful one, but a stillness that waited. When someone in the household fell ill, the quiet grew heavier, less a hush, and more a present. The air seemed to thicken with waiting, and everything slowed. A child might start with a sniffle, a cough muffled beneath blankets, or an old man might shift in his sleep, wheezing softly, breath growing shallower with each passing hour. No physician visited these homes. There was no warm room to recover in. Illness was not banished by firelight and broth. It was endured, wrapped in the same cloaks, within the same walls, with prayers murmured more often than remedies given. Sometimes a village healer was summoned. She would arrive in silence, her presence not marked by drama, but by a basket of dried herbs and a voice low and steady. Her hands would move carefully, unwrapping layers from a fevered body, lifting lids of jars and scattering leaves into water warmed over coals. She spoke in murmurs, part blessing, part instruction, and her footsteps barely stirred the straw beneath her feet. Bundles of elderflower, yarrow, and horehound might be placed near the ailing sleeper. Steam would rise from an iron pot, slowly curling toward the thatch. The scent of mint or pine needles might fill the room, faint and fleeting, but mostly there was silence. Everyone waited. Time was measured in the rhythm of breath, in the pauses between coughs, in the restless shifting of bodies trying to stay warm together. And the cold waited too. It did not storm through the door or crash down the chimney. It simply crept, through the floors across the stones, into bones already weakened. The sick were not separated. They stayed among the family because there was nowhere else to go. Others huddled nearby, sometimes afraid to get too close, sometimes choosing closeness as if defiance might matter more than caution. Food, when it could be spared, was plain. Porridge, if any oats remained, a crust softened in milk. But in the worst weeks of winter, even these became luxuries. And so, the silence of illness was joined by the silence of hunger, the kind that presses on the temples and makes limbs heavy, the kind that echoes in the walls. Sometimes, someone would sing softly, not a song of joy, but one passed down through generations. Lullabies meant not to cheer, but to soothe. Their words were familiar and slow, the tune worn smooth by countless lips. They filled the air like warm breath, curling around rafters, hanging between the beds and benches and low-hung herbs. And then came the hardest part, the waiting. For many, illness was not a sharp drama, but a long, cold endurance. Days blurred, the cold outside deepened, and the sound of coughing in the night was no longer startling. It was a rhythm that accompanied sleep, like a drum in the distance. Children didn't always understand the full weight of it, but they felt the change. Their voices lowered, their play grew quiet, and when they lay down at night, wrapped in wool, side by side with siblings or a parent, they whispered stories beneath the covers. Sometimes they spoke of dreams, small, impossible dreams, that they might wake to warmth, that the cold might forget to come back, that someone might leave a gift of honey or flower outside the door. Stories of hope shaped by necessity. Maybe tomorrow, one child might whisper, the river won't be frozen anymore. Maybe, another would reply, the snow will melt on its own. No one contradicted them. The stories were not to be judged, they were to be shared. In the dark, these soft imaginations filled the space between fear and comfort, and sometimes, if sleep came quickly enough, the dreams did too. In these homes, the smell of sickness mixed with smoke and straw. It was not bitter or sharp, but low and steady, like damp water. People grew used to it. They did not speak of it unless necessary. The sick, too, learned to suffer quietly. A groan might bring concern, but silence brought endurance. And for many, that was the only choice. When a family member passed, there was no ceremony of grandeur. A candle might be lit, a cloth might be draped, and the household continued. Changed but not broken. Death in winter was not rare, it was part of the rhythm. Like harvest, like sowing, like snow. Grief came slowly, often delayed by the business of surviving. But not all stories ended that way. Some coughs faded, some fevers broke, and a mother might one day find her child's cheeks pink again, his eyes open and searching. Hope in such homes did not shout, it whispered. It lingered in the way someone stirred in the morning after days of stillness, in the way hands long idle began to reach again for bread, for broth, for warmth. Neighbors might visit when they could. They brought nothing fancy, a bit of dried apple, not chunk of lard. A story. Their voices offered more than comfort. They reminded the sick and the grieving that the world still turned, that somewhere beyond the frost-covered field a cow had calved, or someone had found eggs hidden beneath a hen. These visits, however brief, were offerings, not of cure, but of presence. And so the nights passed, slowly, with cold, with silence, with endurance. The walls of the cottage held them all. Those sleeping, those sick, those caring. The straw on the floor, the blankets of patchwork and pelt, the bundled clothing. They form a cocoon. Fragile, but sacred. There were no grand fires, no thick quilts. No remedies that guaranteed recovery, but there was still warmth, in touch, in closeness, in the resolve of a mother's hands pulling the blanket tighter, in the patience of a father holding a fevered child through the night, his own eyes never closing, in the quiet courage of people who had so little and gave so much of what they had to one another. And when the sun rose, pale and slow, the world seemed unchanged. The trees still bare, the snow still deep, but within the home the smallest shift could feel monumental, a cough less severe, a sigh instead of a moan, or even just the stillness of a night not broken by a cry. This was how they endured the harshest winters, not with firelight and luxury, but with layers and silence, with wool and patience, and with an unspoken agreement to hold on together until the cold passed through. The thaw never arrived all at once. It came gradually, like a whisper after long silence, a drip at the edge of the roof, a change in the wind's tone. The snow, once packed tight against doorways and frozen into the earth itself, began to shift, to soften, to sag in on itself, as if it too had grown weary of holding so firm. In the early morning, the sharp white edge of the world blurred into something slushier, gentler, streaked with the brown of thawed paths and trampled straw. The fields were still bare, the trees still skeletal, but there was something in the air, barely perceptible, like a loosening. The wind, though still cold, no longer carried the same sting. Smoke from the hearth no longer clung to the earth like a blanket, but rose freely, drifting upward as though it had forgotten the weight of winter. Inside the cottage, changes came with similar quiet. A window opened, just a sliver, to let out the stale breath of too many long nights. Boots, worn thin at the soles, were set near the door once again, not for urgent journeys, but for the slow return to the outside world. Children sat by the threshold, watching the slow trickle of melt water from the thatch, counting drops with soft voices and quiet awe. Their breath, no longer misting visibly in the air, became just breath again, unnoticed, unshivering. Spring did not erase what came before. The rooms still bore the marks of winter. Patched blankets, threadbare cloaks hung carefully by the door, dried herbs now limp with age, and the soot that had darkened walls during months of close firelight and low burning. But these were not burdens. They were reminders, quiet witnesses to the season that had passed. In the corners of the room, where shadows still clung, dust shimmered in the pale sunlight. Not vibrant light, but the kind that glows softly, as if remembering something. The hearth, once a place of silent prayer during illness, was now a place of idle warmth. A pot of thin stew simmered, not because it was the only thing left to eat, but because it was what could be prepared slowly without worry. A mother stirred it while humming a song she hadn't touched in months. A father mended a fence just beyond the doorway, his tools finally usable again after being frozen into stillness. And the children, ever watchful, tiptoed out into the yard with sticks and laughter, their feet still cautious, but their eyes wide again. Inside, elders sat with blankets across their laps, not out of desperation now, but out of habit. They watched the room as one watches the final act of a long play, without urgency, but with a deep sense of presence. They remembered the worst of the cold, the silence of hunger, the rattle of breath in the dark, and they did not speak of it loudly. But now and then, in a corner of conversation, the words would surface. That night, when the wind howled like it meant to take the roof, "And ye wrapped the baby in your own cloak, remember?" Laughter might follow, not because it was funny, but because they had made it, and survival, in its own quiet way, invited laughter, even soft, even brief. The return of spring was not a celebration with ribbons and bells. It was slower, rooted in small observations. The first green tip of nettle peeking beside the path, the moment a goat gave birth and the air filled with its tiny bleating. The feel of soil beneath fingernails again. Hands long wrapped in wool were now bare again, callous but free. And with each of these moments came a memory, not spoken, but felt, of the nights shared shoulder to shoulder, the quiet weeping muffled beneath blankets, the mornings when no one spoke until they were certain everyone had survived the night. People visited one another again, not out of obligation, but because the world had opened its doors. Neighbors brought eggs, shared stories, exchanged bundles of early herbs. And when they gathered, their voices were lower than they had been before the frost. Reverent, perhaps, without meaning to be. They spoke of the frozen barrel that finally thawed, of the sheep that almost didn't make it, of the child who never cried, even in the coldest nights, and when they left, they lingered at the threshold, reluctant to step away too quickly from the company they had missed. Some families buried their dead only when the ground had softened. The graves dug in early spring were shallow, but careful. Flowers, when found, were laid in silence. No grand words were needed. The earth in its thaw welcomed them gently. And those left behind marked the place not only with stones or symbols, but with the shape of memory. A father who once tended the fire, a sister whose cough had grown quiet too soon. They remained, not in mourning, but in the rhythm of daily life. Every bowl used, every thread woven, every stool sat upon carried traces of them. Yet life returned, not as a rush, but as a trickle. Bread was baked with a bit more flour, curtains were washed and hung in the faint wind, chickens pecked freely again, no longer huddled in corners. And the laughter of children grew louder, braver. Dreams, once spoken of in whispers during the longest nights, now drifted towards sunlight. The dream of a feast, the dream of a song, the dream of a summer so warm they would forget what frost even felt like. But no one truly forgot. Winter had left its imprint. Not a scar, but a shape. A curve in the shoulders, a crease in the brow, a softness in the voice. It reminded them to be careful with one another, to share without being asked, to notice when someone had grown too quiet. The lessons of hardship were folded into spring-like seeds in warm earth, quiet, essential. And so, even as the days grew long and the smell of wet grass filled the air, the memory of the cold remained. It did not haunt, it lingered. In gratitude, in caution, in the soft moments before sleep when someone would tuck the blanket a little tighter even if the night was no longer cold, in the way stories were told, with pauses, respectful, slow, letting silence speak. And each time the wind shifted, just enough to stir the curtain or nudge the wooden door, the family remembered that survival was not the absence of fear, or of pain, or of loss. It was the quiet decision, made again and again, to remain, to wait for warmth, to reach for another hand in the dark, and to welcome spring not as a miracle, but as a gentle promise fulfilled. The promise that no matter how deep the frost, no matter how long the silence, light would return. And so it did, quietly, without fanfare, just as they had always known it would. The cold has lifted now, not only from the ground, but from the memory, and though we've travelled through many frozen rooms and darkened hearths together, we leave behind not sorrow, but stillness. A soft stillness that lingers after hardship, the kind that remains when the frost has gone, but the lessons it taught stay folded inside warm blankets and quietly mended walls. We began this journey with a single question. How did peasants survive winter without fireplaces? The answer, as we've seen, was never just about tools or techniques. It was about people, quiet resilience woven into each long night, straw underfoot, Blankets made from memory as much as from wool. Warmth that came not from fire, but from closeness, from ritual, from the choice to stay. We wandered through shared beds and shuttered barns. We watched meals made from nearly nothing, boiled slow with hope. We sat beside the quiet suffering of coughs in the dark, of hunger unspoken. And we saw, too, the small beauties that endured, a murmur of prayer, a mother's hand smoothing linen, a song whispered to the rafters. Even in scarcity there was tenderness. And when spring returned, it did not come to erase winter, it came to lay beside it, like a new blanket on a tired bed. The snow melted, yes, but it did not carry away the stories. Those stayed, in the way the children played near the path that had once been buried, in the way a neighbor lingered a little longer at your door, in the way someone still tucked the corners of a blanket just so. And maybe, in your own quiet moments tonight, you can still feel some of it. The hush of snow against a cottage roof, the slow exhale of two bodies beneath a shared quilt, the brittle edges of cold softening into the first signs of thaw, and the deep, gentle knowing that warmth returns. History, like winter, teaches us patience. It reminds us that comfort is not always immediate, that endurance is made of small things, and that sometimes simply staying together, silent, waiting, is the greatest strength of all. If your breath has slowed, if your thoughts have softened, if your eyes have grown heavy, then perhaps this story has done what it came here to do. Thank you for walking through the snow with me tonight. If your heart feels just a little warmer, if your rest comes just a little easier, you're welcome to return any time. This is Boring Pass for Sleep, and here even winter is gentle. Good night, and sleep well.